Hey everybody, it's Mr. Miller. I don't know who else you were expecting, but it's me. So anyway, learning targets for today is that I can understand how the Vietnam War started, I can understand how the Vietnam War ended, and I can understand the importance of the Vietnam War. So actually the history of Vietnam, and like it says short history, but like I should really have it as Vietnam War. All right. This is just about the war itself, not about Vietnam's history. I already talked about that in another video, but the war actually like the beginning of the war, if you really want to get technical, started after World War One. So after World War One, the Vietnamese communist leader, his name's Ho Chi Minh, he goes to Paris when all the other world powers are like squabbling over like who's going to get what after World War One ends. He goes to Paris and he says, "Hey, we want to be independent of France. Like I told you in the last video, France controlled Vietnam. We do not want to be part of France. We deserve to be our own country right now." But France did not do that, and the other world powers said no. And it's because France won World War One with the rest of the Allies. Two is that Ho Chi Minh was a very open communist. And if you recall from our communist video, that the communist revolution in Russia was very bloody and violent, and people were terrified and scared. So they weren't going to let Ho Chi Minh have his own government, even though that he was really popular and he really wasn't that bad of a guy. All right. So then flash forward to after World War II. So after the Japanese were beaten out of Vietnam, Vietnam says, you know what? We're not doing this whole thing with France anymore. They say, we are our own independent country. We have fought for our freedoms. We're not doing it anymore. Um, but the people in Vietnam wanted a communist government, which scares America and other countries around the world. So, and France doesn't just lay down and say, okay, you can be your own country. No, there's a whole war that goes through it. So in 1954, America actually helps out France. They give money and weapons to France to stop Vietnam from being its own country. That doesn't work. Vietnam becomes independent. Why? It's because of that geography that I talked about in like a few videos ago, is that it's really hard to navigate in the jungles and the mountains of Vietnam. And France had better technology and weapons than the Vietnamese, but the Vietnamese knew the land and they knew where to hide and how to fight differently, like guerrilla style fighting in the jungles and stuff, whereas France did not. Okay. So what happens is when France surrenders to the Vietnamese army at this peace treaty agreement, it was agreed that eventually that Vietnam would be one big country. But at that point, they couldn't handle it because France controlled everything and they had to leave. So then what happened is that they divided, like this picture shows, that Vietnam was divided into two countries. There's the North Vietnam, which was the which was controlled by the communists and Ho Chi Minh, and then in the South there was the capitalists, and it was pretty much just propped up by the American government military. Okay, so the agreement was in 1954 that 2 years later, in 1956, both countries would vote on what kind of country one Vietnam would be. Would it be a communist country or would it be capitalist? But in 1956, remember, ladies and gentlemen, what I just said, that South Vietnam is pretty much controlled by America. They're holding up the South Vietnam, which is down here. They refuse to have an election. They're like, you know what? We're not going to have an election because we know the communists are going to win and we can't afford to let the country become communist, because that's how much America disliked communist countries. They were scared of them. So then what happens is that North Vietnam's like, you know what? We're going to invade and we're going to take over the entire South and it's just going to be communist no matter what. So South Vietnam and North Vietnam are fighting each other. America is not involved in the war yet. They're just propping up the country with money and keeping the government in South Vietnam afloat. All right. But America would join the war on March 8th, 1965, because there was an American boat that was destroyed in North Vietnam, and America thought that communists were behind it. To this day, it's a really hot button issue in America because, like, there's a lot of people who didn't want to fight in Vietnam because Vietnam's such a tiny little country. It didn't mean much. And a lot of people in this country still believe today that that wasn't true and the American government made it up. And that's something to maybe talk to your parents or grandparents about because a lot of them lived through it. But the point is that there's a lot of people that don't understand what really caused the war for America to get dragged into the war. Anyway, so America left the war on January 27th, 1973, after fighting the war for 19 years. Technically, the United States didn't lose. They just said, we're done fighting it because there was not a point to it. So then after that, the North and South were still fighting each other. And 2 years later, on April 30th, 1975, when the communists took over the entire country, the war ended. So the communists in the North won. They took over the entire rest of the country. So when the communists did invade southern Vietnam, 120,000 people from the South fled the country. The reason for this being is that the communists were killing civilians. They were just killing them because they felt that they were superior and they could do whatever they want because they won the war. So there was hundreds of thousands of refugees, just like in this boat here, all crammed, packed together in boats and in helicopters and planes. There was a lot of refugees who were able to move to America. Some also moved to European countries. And to this day, there are still refugees in Vietnam that live in the United States. And actually, in Wisconsin, there is a huge population there's an ethnic group of Vietnamese, and they're called Hmong. And it's actually not like Mung, it's Hmong. It's like Hmong. And a lot of them live up in the Green Bay area. I know this because my cousins live up there. And actually, in northern Wisconsin, things are written in English and then Spanish and then Hmong. So like you'll be driving by and all of a sudden you'll see something that looks like it's Asian language and it's because it's Vietnamese. So there's still a lot of people who live here that have migrated from there. Our author of our book is a migrant. So keep that in mind when we're moving forward. So this war still has effects today in modern day society. Thank you for your time.